And now we move on to our next speaker, who we will have with us online, visiting us from the United States, I believe. And this is Ali Kateusz. And Ali Kateusz is a cultural historian specializing in the intersection of women and religion in early Christian art and texts. She's the research associate at the Vineyards Institute for Catholic Research and published many articles in many learned journals. And her most recent book is Maria, Marianne, and Miriam, Rediscovering the Marys. And she's also written a book earlier, an illustrated book called Mary and Early Christian Women, Hidden Leadership. So Dr. Ali Kateusz, we welcome you and look forward to what you will be discussing, which is women and men at the table from the early Christian era.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to switch over to my PowerPoint without much ado because I really do work a lot with early Christian art. So bear with me here while I share my screen. There we go. So the title here of my talk is Women and Men at the Table, basically the altar table in the early Christian era. I know this is kind of a counter narrative to what we're often told, that there never were any women ever at the early Christian table. And it's just sort of a modern feminist dream that it might be true. But in fact, the very earliest evidence indicates that women were at the Christian altar tables in churches, and that women were there very consistently and in the most important basilicas in Christendom. So all of the iconographic artifacts that depict women at a Christian altar in my presentation here are older than the oldest surviving art to depict only a man or only men at a church altar. I almost think that bears repeating because it actually took me a while to realize it. I used to work along with this art and think, oh, surely there's all these artifacts that depict men at altars, right? No, not when I finally went and looked for them. There are not. So all of the iconographic artifacts that depict women at a Christian altar in my presentation are older than the oldest surviving art to depict only a man or men and men only at a church altar. Now, that's not to say we don't have women and men at church altars. We do, but we also have women at church altars. We just don't have, in the very earliest art, men and only men at church altars. For more details, I've been publishing on this fairly frequently since 2017, an article in the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion. I also published something very similar to the current presentation in Priscilla Papers, which is really easy to read. 2020, I was one article that I was recently translated into Greek in Theologia, and I've done some others, a couple of other, one other chapter in the Maria Miriam book, as well as, it seems to me, and I can't bring them to mind, something else as well. But most importantly, and I think probably the most extensive and the most detailed investigation of these is in my most recent chapter, which just came out this year, which is in which is the chapter Women Church Leaders in and Around 5th Century Rome, which is in the book Patterns of Women's Leadership in Early Christianity, which is a fabulous book, just a fabulous book, which is edited by Joan Taylor and Ilaria Romelli. Luca Bedini, also with the Vineyards Institute for Catholic Research, and I jointly put this together, and it was published by Oxford University Press. And again, it just came out this spring. So I was super happy when I saw that the editors at Oxford University Press had chosen what I consider one of the very most important scenes in this early art to put on the front cover. And this is the portrait of a man and a woman at the altar table of Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So I'll hit that one, I'll hit that artifact first. This is an ivory reliquary box. Most of this art actually was discovered in the 20th century, and I think it only survived because it was buried underground. And at least that was the case for this one, which was probably originally buried in some type of reliquary box under the altar of a Roman era church near Pola in Croatia. And it was dug up as part of an excavation in 1906. And when the archaeologist who was first involved with it published it, Anton Wiers, he easily recognized that this was an extremely important piece because this is actually the very oldest scene of the liturgy in a Christian church. And he recognized the importance of it for that very reason. And quite remarkably, it doesn't depict the liturgy the way it might look today. And there's absolutely no controversy that there are three men on the left here. There's never been any controversy that these are men, 1, 2, 3, and that these are women, 1, 2, 3. That's not controversial, never has been controversial. And for the first 40 years, there also was no controversy that this right here was a Christian altar and that the man and the woman here were at the altar. So there was no controversy about this. There are a large number of art historians who were very interested in this piece and who published it not long after it was first published by Anton Wiers. And just everybody recognized it as an altar, which quite plainly it seems to be, doesn't it? So a closer look at the scene. The two men on the left and the two women on the right have their arms raised. They seem to me possibly to be singing. And we have a ciborium over the altar with a big lamp to shine on the altar. Very beautiful, with curtains behind. And the scene in the center, which is really quite beautiful itself, depicts a man on the left, a woman on the right. And there sometimes arises the question, well, could they be venerating the cross? What are they doing? And that was rather definitively answered early on by Joseph Wilpert and also Henri Leclerc, who wrote about, both of whom were Vatican scholars, who wrote that no, this can't be they're venerating the cross because there's no history whatsoever of any relic of the true cross being in Old St. Peter's Basilica. So that's not what it is. Now, what they typically didn't mention, but which has been suggested a few times in recent years, is that the woman is holding some kind of container, perhaps a cup, perhaps a bowl, I say perhaps a chalice. Now, Anton Wiers himself didn't recognize it, that these columns were so special, but fairly soon afterwards, was published an article, a short article that showed some of the columns that are still in the galleries of of the modern St. Peter's, and which were reputedly donated to Old St. Peter's Basilica for its ciborium over its altar, around its altar. And they're very famous, curved, delicately, just gorgeous spiral columns. It was recognized that these were virtual matches for the ones that still survive today. Indeed, there are 6 of them, just as was reported to have been the case for the 6 that Constantine donated. So the question then began to arise, well, could this possibly be Old St. Peter's Basilica, the liturgy in Old St. Peter's Basilica as it was when this box was carved, which was late 300s, probably early 400s. So these are very beautiful columns. You see how they've been placed in almost a hexagon, a half hexagon, a trapezoid shape. And so originally in the apse, they would have looked like this. And the light would have lit up the mosaic in the apse behind, and as well as the altar below. Quite beautiful, beautiful design. So we have a gender parallel liturgy in Old St. Peter's Basilica. What did the Vatican have to think about that? Well, at the beginning of World War II, the ivory box was taken to Italy from Yugoslavia. Then Yugoslavia was taken to Italy for safekeeping. And in 1941, the Vatican began these remarkable excavations, going against their own rule that you should never excavate beneath the altar. They started these remarkable excavations beneath the high altar of the modern St. Peter's Basilica. And they could not excavate anything in the front of the altar because that was the confessio, kind of the deep marble pit, and there's so many pilgrims and tourists that they instead came in behind, and they excavated down from behind. And what they discovered was a stack of medieval altars. And right below the medieval altars, they discovered an approximately 8-foot by 8-foot wall, a shrine, with a stone mensa with legs actually embedded in it, and even a carved niche like we see here on this one. So they believe, and it even had a tomb structure nearby below. And what they believed was that this was the 2nd century shrine to Peter that was known from some early writings in the church, and that the entire basilica then appeared to have been oriented around this shrine. And in fact, this is virtually the only thing that survives from the old St. Peter's Basilica, because Gregor the Great renovated the entire area of this part of the area, the sanctuary. And then, of course, when the new St. Peter's Basilica was built during the 1500s or so, the excavations then just really destroyed everything. But the shrine was saved, even though it was hidden and below all these other altars. So the Vatican archaeologists, were convinced then at that point, perhaps they had hoped to show that it couldn't have been Old St. Peter's Basilica on this scene, but then they realized it indeed was Old St. Peter's Basilica on this scene. And they all agreed about that. But they didn't publish their findings officially for 10 years until 1951. And, you can imagine this might have caused some consternation, because here we do have a man and a woman at what everybody at that time had agreed, all the scholars had agreed was an altar table. So what did they do? Well, when they published in 1951, remarkably, they had a couple of drawings. Now, they didn't say that they had excavated in front, and indeed they did not. And some of the drawings, one of the drawings, for example, has little dots that show that it wasn't excavated. This is just sort of their imagination of what it must have been. But they said that, well, there must have been a square ciborium, 20-foot by 20-foot square ciborium. And, the arches, the trusses would have crossed in the center, and that's where the little light would have hung, the big light, the big lamp. And of course, they said it was under the big light, the big lamp, that is where you would have found the altar. So they said there must have been a portable altar. There must have been a portable altar table. Well, of course, we know it wasn't a square ciborium. It was a half hexagon. It was a trapezoid ciborium. Nonetheless, the gender politics of the time, well, first I might say that even within the Vatican, there was in some corners, there was a great rejection of this whole concept, because both Jerome and Gregory of Tours had said that the altar in Old St. Peter's was directly over Old St. Peter's tomb. In fact, Jerome said it was on top of St. Peter's tomb. And that the Eucharist was performed right on top of St. Peter's tomb. But nonetheless, the gender politics of the time, including the fact that there was a big debate at the time about the ordination of women in the Anglican Church, kind of oriented the final propaganda around this to be that there was a portable altar in Old St. Peter's Basilica. And so here we have not a scene of the liturgy, not so much. No, not at all. This is just a scene of a couple of pilgrims at Old St. Peter's tomb. And so that was sort of, now there were those who kind of subtly pointed out or questioned it, Peter Brown being one, a few other scholars recently, but no one has really taken it on until just recently. when I took it on, frankly. And I'm pretty happy to say that since 2017 until now, 2021, we finally are getting the proper and good scholarly recognition that indeed that was sort of a Vatican hiccup there in the middle. And indeed, we can now see it as what it is, a man and a woman at the altar table in Old St. Peter's Basilica. And this is the very oldest liturgical scene in Christian art in a church. So one might ask, okay, so we have this, that's fantastic. Well, also in this this chapter, we also discuss other scenes which very much corroborated also in very important basilicas in Christendom at that time. The first of those that I want to bring up is a chancel screen with a liturgical scene, probably of the second Hagia Sophia in Constantinople around 430. And this was discovered in 1988 at the foot of the Theodosian walls in Istanbul, in a hypogeum, an underground tomb structure where this actually was reused as the massive front of a big, one of several sarcophagus in this tomb structure. And it's recently been recognized or suggested that this probably actually was a chancel screen or part of the chancel screen in the second Hagia Sophia. So when it was discovered, Ümit Saradaglu, who was the archaeologist on site, as well as Johann Deckers, noticed that the capital, the column capitals look very much like that of the second Hagia Sophia. And here we have an early Christian cross, what appears to be a ciborium, and with curtains and a little screen in front with the altar. And we have on the right a woman, and on the left a man in virtually mirror poses down to the pointing of their feet, their arms raised, and a young man, a boy, who holds a book open like a bishop and has his hand in the position of, gesturing a speech gesture, almost as if he were the little bishop. And the timing, the dating of this has been very closely dated to around 430 by the early Christian cross, by the pin on the man's cloak, and various things. So it corresponds quite precisely to the consecration of this church. It replaced the first Hagia Sophia. The second Hagia Sophia itself burned in the Nika riots later under Justinian and was itself rebuilt by Justinian as the current Hagia Sophia that we're accustomed to, with the giant dome in Istanbul. So this is the second Hagia Sophia, and it was consecrated by the Princess Pulcheria, who was the regent for her younger brother. Their parents were dead. She was the titular empress. And a document called the Letter of Cosmos said that Pulcheria had the custom of standing with her brother in the Holy of Holies during the communion. Now in, I believe 430, there was a new patriarch in Constantinople, Nestorius, rather an infamous name. And he, according to the Letter of Cosmos, stood at the door of the Holy of Holies and prevented Pulcheria and her women from entering, saying, "Only priests may enter here." Well, you can imagine Pulcheria wasn't very happy about that. And indeed, the next year, the Council of Ephesus was called, and it promptly expelled Nestorius from his position and banished him to the outer reaches of the empire. And also, we might imagine that quite likely, immediately after that, Pulcheria resumed her previous custom, which a beautiful artifact, which is rather massive, would seem to validate the story in the Letter of Cosmos. Now, in addition to that, 150 years later, 130 years later, rather, we see another scene of the liturgy, probably in the current Justinian's Hagia Sophia. And this is two mosaics that are in the altar apse of San Vitale in Ravenna, on either side of the altar. On the left is Justinian with his men, and on the right is Theodora with her women. And this is often said to be a liturgical procession in the Hagia Sophia, although up until now, typically there's not been total agreement on what kind of liturgical procession, because it does depict Justinian with the plate for the bread and Theodora with the chalice. Interestingly, three men on the right here of Justinian appear to be clerics. The first, it appears to be the Bishop Maximianus. At least his name later was written over his head. He has a episcopal pallium, one of the first examples of the episcopal pallium in art, one of the very first. And next to him appears to be a man holding a gospel book, and then next to him, a man holding a censer. And this is, to my knowledge, the very oldest image of a man holding a censer in a church in early Christian art. Now, interestingly, to the right here of Theodora, we also have three clerics, what appear to be women clerics. And I'm not the only one to suggest such a thing, but here we have what appear to be two women with perhaps Eucharistic handkerchiefs hanging down beneath their garment, and one of them appears to be holding it. And this is very much like we see in art associated with the Eucharistic handkerchief, which we see here on the left, in Old St. Clement's Basilica, wall painting that depicted Bishop, or really Pope Clement at that time, performing the Eucharist with his open book and his pallium and his red papal shoes, and the cup and the plate on the altar table behind him. So Alexei Lidov says, just because they're women does not mean that these are not Eucharistic elements, especially when they are in what appears to be a liturgical procession with the Eucharistic utensils. So good for Alexei Lidov. I'd love to quote him. So we have here, again, the men on the left of the altar, the women on the right, just as in Old St. Peter's Basilica, just as in the second Hagia Sophia. And this appears to be a similar type of liturgy that we saw on that stone chancel screen previously. Now, I would like to next take a look at what is the very oldest artifact to depict only one sex at the altar. And that is women. Sometimes I like to present these with beards on them because it's kind of funny. Everybody can imagine that, yes, these people are at an altar and it's a liturgical procession if they have beards. And then I take the beards off and, oh, well, they're women at the altar in this liturgical procession, aren't they? It's a very beautiful box. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art now. It too was discovered very late. It came to, we don't know the exact provenance. It was sold in 1906 to Rockefeller, who then donated it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where it's on display. And I don't think it gets near the amount of attention that it should. But in any case, it's ivory carving. It was probably carved in Palestine. Originally at the auction, it was thought to be dated to the 300s, now 500s. And it's probably, it's very similar to another pyx that depicts the altar area without any people in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And with the round shape of the pyx sort of resembling or bringing to mind the rotunda, the famous rotunda of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is probably the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And you might imagine also the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built around and over the empty tomb, purportedly, is very much associated with the women who appeared to the risen Christ and whom Christ sent to tell the men the good news that Christ had risen, essentially sending Mary Magdalene and the women as the apostles to the apostles. Or if we are going to think that the male apostles are bishops, well, then we might say that the women were the bishops of the bishops and sent to teach them. Because after all, they were kind of frightened and hiding away and they needed to be taught news. So here we have them. We have a tripod what appears to be a stone tripod altar table with the gospel books on it, a big lamp hanging over it. We have these curved columns again, spiral columns, which again are in kind of a half hexagon, a trapezoid shape, much like we saw at Old St. Peter's Basilica. And I tend to think that perhaps Old St. Pete, the altar area of Old St. Peter's Basilica around the shrine of St. Peter was intended to sort of mimic this important area of Jerusalem. Have the curtains hanging back, and we have two women carrying censers approaching the altar area. Now, this is the very oldest scene, to my knowledge, of anyone in a church carrying a censer, and it is two women carrying these censers. These are women sculpted earlier than the mosaic was made in San Vitale. And around the side of the pyx, we have women in this liturgical procession, women and only women. And interestingly, they too have this Eucharistic insignia, as we saw with the women with Theodora in the mosaic in San Vitale in that procession. And clearly they're women. So we have a liturgical procession of women clerics to the altar. Now we've gone forward in time a little bit, and it's just take a moment to go back in time a little bit to the Christian catacombs of the city of Rome. So where we find the Basilica of St. Peter's and what's going on in its, at its altar, at its table, in its liturgy. Let's take a look at what was going on underground. So we have these remarkable paintings underground in the Christian catacombs of Rome. And what's really remarkable about them, they're called funereal meals these days. If they were men and only men, we might imagine that, oh, they would be called the Eucharist. But everybody agrees it's the women raising the cup. And this is really quite remarkable because in Roman art, Roman religion, funereal art, it's always, virtually always the man who is raising the cup. So these Christian scenes really reveal something very different in terms of a funereal scene anyway, or funereal art, than what happened in Roman art. So we have, this is in Marcellino and Pietro Catacomb. There are a series of these which have some similarity in that, you know, it's a woman raising the cup. There's a tripod table in the center, which appears to have a fish or bread on it, and there's some people seated at a table. Late 200s, early 300s, probably pre-Constantinian. And we see the woman raising a cup or a chalice or a glass. And what's really, quite interesting here is that we also have a man with a cup on the opposite side here. And that is one of the most interesting things about several of these, that there's a man and a woman who appear to be gender parallel. There's some, both leaders, the man and the woman of the meal. And this corresponds to something that Irenaeus of Lyon wrote about around the year 180. And he wasn't writing about his own church, but he was kind of complaining about Christians in another church that he knew about. And he described their liturgy, which first a woman would consecrate the wine, he said. He called it Eucharistine. And in doing so in her cup, she would then pour the wine into the cup of the man. And they would mix it, and then it would be become the service. And he really complained about the woman being involved in this. But clearly, way back when, this kind of liturgy, you might call it, or ritual at least, Eucharistic literal in terms of Eucharist being the blessing, but also in this case, the consecration and using of the wine in this ritual it's documented very, very early, not only in the catacombs of Rome, which are themselves very earlier, but even earlier with Irenaeus of Lyon. So in terms of how we might look at these pictures, just another way related to women and what they were doing, we have, of course, this woman who's raising the cup. And we have the woman at the altar in Old St. Peter's Basilica who also has been said to be raising some kind of vessel or cup. And of course, we have Empress Theodora, 100 years later than that, clearly holding the chalice. I'm going to leave you with that scene for a moment to just sort of internalize the documentary evidence in art, which has been ignored, redefined, but which nonetheless is really clear, very clear, with respect to the roles that women were playing in the very earliest church. In my opinion, these correspond very closely to the overseer role that women were so often identified in New Testament Acts and also in Paul's letters as the leaders of the churches in their homes, which if they had been men and men only, we would say, oh, well, those were the first bishops. Women were, even the Romans and the Greeks were very much in agreement that women were very, very active in the early Christ movement. And in fact, they often complained about it, and that's how we know about it. And to think that they weren't there, or they just disappeared, is incorrect. They were there, they stayed there.
What a fascinating lecture. We could go on listening to you and learning and these amazing works of art that you have studied. Thank you for bringing that. What we're going to do right now, I'm going to hand over to Miriam Dignan, who's going to ask Ali some questions. We've been getting questions online, and I hope you do remember that you can send your questions by email to this synod, rbsynodchat@gmail.com. So if you've got questions, please email them in. And we're going to have some questions and answers with Dr. Ali Kateusz. And to ask those questions is Miriam Dignan. Now, just a word about you, Miriam, is that Miriam I've known for many years, and our paths have crossed, and strangely, they've always crossed when we were talking about something about women and the church and exclusion and inclusion and subjects like that.
We're a bit obsessed.
Just obsessed. Just can't get over it.
Yeah.
Just a word. Miriam is the Director of Communications at the Vineyards Institute and is a passionate advocate of advancing gender equality, sexual ethics, and decision-making in the Catholic Church. And for those who haven't heard of the Vineyards Institute, it focuses on cutting-edge theological research by coordinating leading academics worldwide to collaborate on reports tackling the Church's officially uncomfortable, difficult, and disputed areas.
Thank you, Christina.
Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Ali. Can you hear me okay? I feel like I'm shouting.
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. All right, so I'm going to read out some questions that we've received online, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of a roving mic situation here in the room in Bristol and take some questions. So just a little comment from me, Ali. Thank you very much. Christina Rees, who's sitting next to me, gave a talk earlier today that you probably missed because it's now currently 7 o'clock in Kansas where Ali is. So that would have been about 3 a.m. your time. And Christina was talking to us about how to bring about change in the Catholic Church. And she said to do so, we need to take on 3 things: tradition, hierarchy, and patriarchy. And that we need to have a clear vision of what the alternative is. Now, what I think your work does, and everyone who knows Ali's work, is that it completely dismantles anyone who claims that the tradition of the Christian church excluded women from the outset. And some of the questions we're getting already are hinting at that. And also, in terms of having a clear vision of the alternative, I think the art that you find and research and explain so beautifully what it means, it shows us that we already have that alternative vision. We just need everyone to see it, everyone, everywhere. Now, we launched Ali's book, which is called Marian Early Christian Leadership, Hidden Leadership, in July 2019 in Rome, and it did actually cause quite a stir. You can get that book, it's a picture book, and you can get that book online for free, thanks to a very generous donation. It's been made freely available. Send it to all your friends, make sure everybody sees it and reads it, because we have the evidence right there. I mean, at the time, it did cause quite a stir. We were in Rome. It even got written up, it featured in the Daily Mail. So I wouldn't normally recommend you read the Daily Mail, but they featured Ali's work and they featured our book launch, which happened on Vatican territory because it was actually at the Gregorian University Pontifical Academy. And their headline said how the Catholic Church has covered up early Christian art depicting women at the altar for hundreds of years. They covered it up. And I think that's quite key to one of the first questions that's come in here. Why would you cover something up if it didn't mean anything? What's so dangerous about this? So, Ali, the first question for you. It's, okay, 3 more coming in. Okay, which one am I doing first? So, I can do that one. It's interesting that these arch discoveries from the 3rd century, do we see any evidence of women in liturgical roles from the 1st and 2nd centuries of the church, i.e. in the Roman catacombs? If not, why not? Did women start being priests after a couple of centuries for some reason?
Just an easy question to start with, right? Let's see here. Okay. Okay, so first I want to say one thing. The book was published by Palgrave Macmillan, and though you can download it because it's open access, it's also available as a hardback, pretty inexpensively from Amazon, for example. So I wanted to point that out. I make no money on it because it's open access, but it is available that way. So this question is about is there any evidence in the 1st and 2nd century? Not in art, because there is no early Christian art that early. None survived, probably because in part the Christians simply weren't big enough or maybe wealthy enough. But in any case, everyone agrees there's no Christian art that early. So I think that we do have textual material, though. For example, we might, from this, start to reinterpret some of what we're seeing in the New Testament and Paul in terms of the women who were identified before the men. In some of these cases, the woman apostle Unia, the women who are identified, and it's almost always women who are identified as the leaders of the churches in homes. So there's that and other evidence. For example, Origen talked about Celsus, who was saying that he knew of 7 women evangelists, essentially. And 5 of the people he knew, 7 evangelists, 5 of those were women, 2 were men. So there's a lot of evidence to put together. And I would argue that, I would say very strongly that the book that I showed you that has this chapter that Luca Bedini and I wrote also has other chapters relevant and related to this by other really important scholars related to women in the early Christian era and their leadership. So that would be a good source for you for this question right now. And with respect to the catacomb art, when we do start to see it, for example, the one fresco that I showed you that depicts a woman raising the cup, and there's a little tripod table and a man on the other side. Again, I think it's all how we might interpret this. If we could break out of the Vatican veil, which says, oh no, this can't be a Eucharist because it's a woman. Well, if it were a man, we'd have all these Eucharistic scenes in the catacombs. And instead of, well, these are necessarily funereal meals. I mean, the Didascalia Apostolorum said that you should perform the Eucharist in cemeteries. So why are not these the performance of the Eucharist in cemeteries? And it's by a woman. And clearly, for some years after that, also women. When did it disappear? It didn't. We do not find the first evidence. I think there was a lot of above ground censorship. So for example, it's pretty well known that we do not have any liturgical manuscripts up into the 8th century, neither Christian nor Jewish. There's just tiny little bits and pieces. And when they do appear in the 8th century, they are all made in the same script on the same paper by the same type of hand, that sort of thing. And no serious mainstream scholar today would argue that the liturgies that they pretend to say were old were actually old. They were 8th century, or what 8th century scribes or writers wished to portray as ancients, because somehow in between the beginning and the 8th century, those liturgical manuscripts have almost entirely disappeared. And the same thing with art depicting people. The sole exclusion, to my knowledge, is this basically the scene that depicts Theodora and Justinian on either side of the altar in San Vitale. And I mean, it's a very rich, important church, a very rich scene. So, you don't just necessarily want to always go in and strike out mosaics, but it did survive. We can only imagine what else was in churches. So there seems to be a dearth. What happens is in the 8th century, 8th, 9th century, is when we first see, that's the oldest image of a man, an archbishop, performing the Mass. So there are a couple of, actually, I'm going to just really quickly, do you want me to get around? Okay, yeah, go to the next question.
Let me ask another question.
I could also show you a couple of other things, but I'm going to finish it up and say that's the best answer I've got. Next question.
Fabulous, fabulous. Okay, the next question I'm going to pose to you is a good one. That was a good one too. It seems as though women's leadership was welcomed and accepted during the period when being Christian was low status and often very dangerous. And it faded out once Christians gained imperial recognition and were admitted to positions of power, which fits so well with so much else that we are hearing in the Synod. Do you think that that's what happened? That women were allowed to preside at the altar, co-preside, preside on their own, when Christianity was this sort of little, niche group of people that the Roman culture considered to be a bit weird? And then as soon as they became high status and sort of aligned with the state, that women had to be, shuffled off stage left. Is that what happened?
In part, but I think I would like to just reframe the way that's stated. They weren't allowed, they were just part of it, period. So women were part of the ritual, period. It wasn't the men allowing it. This is the way I believe it came down from, and this is the way it appears to be in the art. So when Christianity entered the Roman Empire, did some of the groups of Christ followers modify things to please or satisfy or help preserve their own wealth? I do believe they did. And there's evidence even in the New Testament of competing groups with respect to women's authority. So I also believe that when Constantine came along, and you've got to remember, he's the most macho of macho men, and probably even a member of Mithras, the cult of Mithras, which only permitted men, not to mention only permitted male priests. And I mean, this is a guy that was so patriarchal, he even put his own wife to death when he suspected her of adultery. So he had an influence. He had a very important influence. Not only did he protect Christians, but he also had an influence in trying to define what they were. But it didn't go, women's roles were so firm and solid, and is the way it looks, is that it didn't just, boom, overnight disappear. This continued, women's roles continued for quite some time. Even in the 7th, 8th centuries, you hear about bishops complaining that women are taking over their altars and offering the blood and body of Christ. So, in some communities, yes, maybe it ended. In others, it did not. And that continued, it appears to me, probably through the end of the millennium in some places, but I think there was another, and I don't quite understand what was going on, but something happened in the 8th and 9th century also.
Okay, fabulous. So on to the next question, Ali. First of all, a comment, and I'll refer to Christina's talk that we had this morning as well. Christina said that when we are trying to bring about change, we have to appeal to 3 things. We have to appeal to people's heads, people who oppose women in leadership, their heads, their hearts, and their gut. So I think, with the heads, it's all the academic research that we've done, everything you can see at womenpriest.org, and hearts. So talking about hearts now, someone has written a comment and a question. This is wonderful. The art is so beautiful and touches our hearts. Very healing for all men and women who, when hearing the brutal words of the patriarchal Vatican early this year, saying that women ordained as priests and their ordainers are excommunicated, while the perpetrators of child sexual abuse could be forgiven. How can any human being who is also a Catholic not feel gutted by such words? Now, Christina's third appeal is to the gut. How can you not feel gutted by this contradiction? Why did we hear no words of protest from good priests with strong equality values about this? Why is there so much fear among male priests? Why do you think they're not speaking out when faced with this evidence and this teaching?
That's the question?
Yeah, why don't priests speak out? Those priests who clearly are dedicated to equality, they can see this evidence, they can feel heartbroken by the fact that a woman will be excommunicated if she gets ordained, whereas their fellow priests who abuse children will not be excommunicated. They will be moved on in many cases. Why is there so much fear that this isn't being shouted from the rooftops by priests?
Well,
by
correct
clergy.
me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that priests have been stripped of their positions for advocating that women should be priests. I mean,
Right.
if they lose all influence within the church, perhaps just like many women who stay in the Catholic Church, they think that if they stay, they can change it.
Right.
Think that's right? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. I think that is
If
right.
they're too vocal, I think they get the boot, or they get
Yeah.
shipped off to some tiny little place where there's not even a television station.
It's true. One of the priests who married my sister, he spoke out about women's ordination and said he'd love to see women priests. It's in rural Ireland in County Kerry, and there's a desperate shortage of priests there. He spoke out and said, I just want to see women priests. He knows people who are called to the priesthood, and he got shuffled off stage left. He wasn't fired, but he was put into this tiny little parish where there's, practically getting water from the well, and he wasn't fired, but he was silenced. It's a very clear signal to the men who do speak out. So really, I think the question is, how do we get such a substantive number of priests to speak out that they can't fire all of them? And that's really where it comes down to, again, I keep on quoting from you, and you're sitting right next to me, where it comes down to that campaign, the strategy of writing letters, giving lectures, connecting with people. Okay, there were 4 L's, but now I've lost them. I can't read my own writing. Lunches, yes, let's do lunch. Any priests that are listening, you're buying, but let's do lunch. So lunches, lectures, leaflets, and letters. So we need to, and this synod is so fantastic for doing that, because there are hundreds and hundreds of people watching. This will be spread far and wide, and we need to spread the word, and we do need those good men, those priests who are currently in within the hierarchy to speak out, because we know there are so many who see this evidence, who know the truth. You know, so many people, so many of the clergy and the senior leaders in the Vatican are theologians, and they know that what you're saying is true, and that's why it's been covered up, because it's dangerous. Okay, I think we have time for another question. Okay. There was one earlier I wanted to go up to. How do I get up? Sorry, technically. Oh, yes, floor. Yes, thank you. Sister? Yes. Can we get a mic to this lady at the front? Yes, will do. Yes.
Thank you. Going back to the art, tradition holds that Bridget of Kildare, the Celtic saint, was a consecrated bishop, and often her pictures depict her with a crozier and a church in her hand. Ali, are you familiar with this picture or sculptures? And if so, have you included that in your writings?
Excellent question. Ali, I'll repeat it for you. So St. Bridget of Kildare, she was known as a bishop. She's depicted as a bishop. She has a crozier in her hand and the church in the other hand. Have you included, are you aware of St. Bridget, and have you included that in any of your publications?
I am aware of St. Bridget. I haven't included her because she's a bit older than the area I usually do work in. But my chapter in this book that I kept showing patterns of women's leadership. My chapter, the one I worked on with Luca Bettini, it says women church leaders, but that was actually to make sure we could get the right pictures to show, because we had to ask some rather Catholic organizations to give us permission. So I couldn't really say women bishops in and around the city of Rome in the 5th century. But it is about other women bishops. So that might be of interest because I would say that it absolutely supports the identification of Bridget as a bishop as well. These earlier bishops, women bishops.
Very good. And can we get the roving mic over here? This lady in the 4th row. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's pursue the theme of women being eradicated from early Christian art. And I would like to say, is the hypothesis that the same happened in the text of the canon of the New Testament as it was put together between 200 and 500 AD?
Great question. So, Ali, the question is, can we assume that what happened with the art also happened with the New Testament, which was put together 200 years after Christ lived and died? Is it the expurgated version? Has it been tampered with to hide certain realities and stories?
I usually don't talk about this because not everybody's aware that the New Testament, the Gospels themselves were written in the 2nd century, not the 1st. But yes, absolutely. I believe that there is an earlier document. I know of one that I'm working on, which actually describes the women as disciples, the women as apostles, which you do not find women called disciples in the 4 Gospels. You do find it once in Acts. So the women disciples, the women apostles, and describes a very different early Christian movement around Jesus and Mary, actually, than we normally think about. And it also depicts a ritual at the Last Supper, very similar to these male and female rituals that I'm showing you here. So absolutely, I do believe that those were expurgated. If you look at my book, Mary and Early Christian Women, you'll see examples where scribes expurgated the liturgical authority of women. Later scribes expurgated the liturgical authority of women present in an earlier text. So I give some examples of that. So absolutely, that was going on 100%. You're totally on target with that.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. I have one question now that's been emailed in. This is, see if we can answer this between us. Might be a group effort. What do we say to those traditionalists who claim, okay, so women were in sacramental roles at first, but we've moved on. And so should you, is kind of the subtext of that. The church has changed in many ways. That early evidence doesn't mean we have to do it now. What do you say to that?
I would say, it's my opinion, that to continue doing what's happening, what is going on now, is absolutely anti-Jesus, anti-Christ, anti-Christian.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. That's all you need to say to people who claim to be traditionalists. I have debated the question of women in ministry many times, and people who claim to be traditionalists, or interviewers will say, what do you say, traditionalists? I say, if you are a traditionalist, you would love Ali's book, and I give you a copy, because here you can really see your tradition, the tradition that you claim to want to preserve, actually includes women, was led by women, and there we have it. Okay, do we have time for any more, or we have to close? Yeah.
One quick anecdote about what happens to people's perception of the priesthood when women have been included, particularly in the Anglican Church. This is coming from, is that when the moment came about 10 years ago, when there were equal numbers of women and men entering theological colleges for ordination training, a journalist came to me as chair of Watch and to someone who was the secretary of Forward in Faith, an organization that was pulled together by the traditionalist Anglo-Catholics in the Church of England who were against having women in as priests and bishops. And I, of course, said things like, isn't it wonderful? This just reflects humanity, you know, equal numbers. This is how it should be. This is a natural state to have arrived at. And his comment was, more or less disaster and doom. And then this absolute stunning statement, well, pretty soon, the priesthood will become just a hobby for grannies. And so you see what was happening there. Not, you know, if women are going to gain power and influence and equality, then that must mean in some way that it's not so important anymore. So in terms about affecting the head, heart, and gut, it's about how we raise up all women in all spheres of life so that their voices are heard as having equal authority. And the journalist Marianne Siegart, who used to be a deputy editor of The Times, she's just written a new book called The Authority Gap, where she talks about how when women are included in decision-making and given equality and given status, that the authority is simply not perceived as equal as men's. So the job is a big one, not just getting women there.
Right. Very good. I think we have to close there, Ali. Thank you very much. Pleasure as always. Thank you, Christina, for having me. Thank you.